First of all, I want to start with why you talk to the kids.
That's interesting. At the time of 9/11, I took it upon myself to come out of the closet. And that's basically what I did. Because that's when we here in the United States lost our innocence. Because of hatred, intolerance. So I came to the museum, and consequently I've been a Holocaust survivor speaker ever since. And that's 5 years ago now.
And what has that done for you?
Well, it's not what it's done for me, because I've known who I am and where I came from. I've never denied it or anything like that. But I became Americanized very early. And as I mentioned inside, someone talking with me said, geez, an Italian guy from New York or something like that. I've got a New York accent. Well, what it's done for me is it's given me an opportunity to talk about important things that the young people must know about. Hatred, intolerance, and what it can do, and the evil that it can spread, and is doing. And what it's done for me, it's given me the opportunity to express myself on those lines. That's about it.
So when the children walk out of here, what do you want them to walk away with?
Knowledge of how wrong it is to hate and what hatred can do.
Start with when the children leave the museum. I want them, or leave from my speaking.
When they leave and they go home, to hear things with different mind, with a more open mind, that primarily that hatred is taught. Nobody's born with hatred. I don't hate anyone. I never did, because I wasn't taught. And to accept those that hate, that they were taught to hate. They're not born with it. And to know that's how to feel about it and how to answer it. Because it's tough for these kids when they hear these things to answer and say, hey, I don't know all the Jews and I don't know all the blacks, and that kind of conversation. So I think that's what the kids will take away with them after they've been here.
Tell me how, I know that you and your mother and father did escape, did come to the United States. How did you and your mother and father deal with what happened to you?
My mother had 3 brothers, all lived in Vienna. None of them survived. My mother, maiden name was Weiss, is the only survivor on her entire side of her family. My father's family was much more fortunate. There was a lot of intermarriage. Jews married to non-Jews. They survived. I had an aunt who converted to Catholicism. Her husband was Catholic. She survived, and she cooked and cleaned for priests the entire Second War. She remained a Catholic. I had an aunt who was married to a non-Jew, and he was a soldier in the German army, which is Austrian. She lived in a little village outside of Vienna on a farm. She never made knowledge of her Jewishness. They survived. They were lucky. We rarely discussed it. We really talked about it. My parents never went back. My father never forgave them for what they did to my grandfather. He starved to death in Theresienstadt. He was 72, 73, cataracts, practically blind, and the old man starved to death. He never forgave them. They never went back to Austria, neither my mother nor my father. The only time I remember anything was when they used to light the Yortzeit lights, particularly at Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur night. They would stand and they would light, and I would leave them alone, and they would both cry. And tonight, when I say Kaddish for my parents, the prayer for the dead, I think of everyone in my family, everyone that was, has been, and I'm the last that will remember. My parents never discussed it. There are other stories that are part of that of people who never went back. There are those who went back. There's some marvelous stories. There was a couple who, he was a cab driver, and she ran the concessions in a coffee house in Vienna. And they both wound up in New York, as many did. And New York, of the 120,000 that got out, 20,000 Jews wound up in New York City. They had their own lifestyle, their own restaurants. They pretty much were able to continue their life as they had in Europe, even though they lived here and they were 100% Americans. Anyway, this couple, at the end of World War II, he got back his cab, and he went back to Vienna, and he got his cab, and he lined up in front of the Opera House for cab riders. And people wanted to know where he was, and so he told them he'd been in the United States. And they told him, "Put stick to you, to saw you." They still cursed at him. Anyway, they got their old apartment back. And then people went back and they got some of their properties back. And the couple went back and they found them. And they were not happy there. So when they got back to New York, they said they're not doing well. He's being ostracized because he's a Jew, and nobody wants to have anything to do with him because they were Jews. So a collection was taken up in the coffee house. And 2 one-way tickets were sent to Vienna to this couple. And sometime later, they arrived in the coffee house. No one has ever said a single word about the particular issue. "Hi, how are you? You want to play a little rummy? You want to play mahjong?" That's all that was said. Nothing else has ever been said. What the hell business do you have going back there? The Austrians, more so than the Germans. The Germans, it's a little bit different. The Austrians, I never forgave them for what they did. Not to me personally in that sense, but just in general, what they did to their fellow Austrians after generations of living there. So that's part of it. Some people do.
Yeah, no, I hear that from all of the survivors that came from Austria, because everyone had been so. I mean, it was such a part of who you were. You were Austrian. You weren't Austrian, not Jewish.
Of course.
All right, so let's go back to. I want really your memories of when you talk about when you first things started changing, when you actually couldn't go back to school. So as a 9-year-old,
yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, as I mentioned to the kids inside.
Don't tell me about you mentioned to the kids, because we'll just kind of.
Yeah, kind of. Okay. Schools, as I said, started with the Lord's Prayer. Unser Vater, wer ist im Himmel. But within days after the Nazis took over, the kids would get up, recite the Lord's Prayer, and then they'd raise their hands and give a salute to Hitler and pledge their allegiance to Hitler. They started wearing little short pants. I would get up, but I never recited the Lord's Prayer because I'm Jewish. Bear in mind, 20% of all the people in Vienna were Jewish. We lived in a pretty Jewish district. And I would say a third of the kids, if not more, happened to be Jews in that classroom. But I could see the difference because there was pushing going on. And then the teacher asked to see my mother. And she came to school with me, and he told my mother that it's best if I don't come back to school because there might be trouble. I'd be beaten up. So that was what I remembered in school. Now also, they tried to start some schools just for Jews. And you can imagine what it's like for a 9, 10-year-old boy going to school only for Jews. I would stand outside in front of our building, And then there was somebody else, and we'd see somebody else. And pretty soon there were 8 or 10 of us who would walk the several blocks to the school, this old broken down school that they set up for Jewish kids. And the teachers we had, they were college professors who had lost their jobs. They didn't teach us math or any of the science subjects, or any of the subjects. They taught us and tried to teach us 2 things: how to survive, and that we are Jews and we are proud to be Jews. That's what we were taught in the Jewish schools. And when you went home together in a group, because the guys were waiting and they would isolate you and beat you up if they could. I'm fortunate, I was never beaten up. I knew how to run. I knew how to run. And that's my memories of that of schooling.
What did your parents tell you? Did you ask them questions? Why is this happening to the Jews?
Of course. Of course. We were told that Hitler, use that name, Hitler hates the Jews. That's pretty much what we were taught. But we've lived with anti-Semitism, particularly in Austria, worse than in Germany, for generations. And we excelled within the system. And we were accepted within the system. But there were always the have-nots who said the rich Jews and the Jews this and the Jews that. That's an old story.
Okay, so the time that you were, tell me about the time when you were confronted going across the street.
Yeah. I was crossing the street to go to my friend's house to play, and I was confronted by 3 Hitler youths, maybe 11, 12 years old. And I tried to avoid them, but I couldn't do that. So I faced them on, and they looked down at me. And one of them said to me, "Are you a Jew?" And I raised my head, and I denied my faith. I didn't want to be beaten up. And I wet my pants, because it's the first time this had happened to me. If I'd seen something on the street and I sensed danger, I could run. I could run. And you know, a 9-year-old boy, not too many people are going to mess with a 9-year-old boy. An adult, yeah. I saw rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, walking in the beginning, and people putting matches to their beards, burning them. I saw the Orthodox rabbis all shave off their beards. I saw people scrubbing the sidewalks with buckets and brushes. But a 9-year-old kid can get lost in the crowd. I saw people being beaten up. Why? That's the questions I would ask. And of course it was, that they're Jews. That's the answer I got home. And then when I was confronted by these kids, I realized that I am a Jew and what it meant personally to be a Jew and survival. Very, very important. So that was at the age of 9. You learn.
Do you think that incident of learning about survival, do you think that has stayed with you your whole life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've had one fist fight on the Lower East Side of New York where I grew up. And that was in the Boys Club camp. And guy kept picking on me all the time. He must have weighed 50 pounds more than me. And I was about 13 at the time. And he kept picking on me. He was 15, and as I said, 16, he outweighed me. And after you had lunch, you had to go back to your cabin, and you had to take what they called a siesta. You took a little nap afterwards before the afternoon activities would start. And he unscrewed the leg of my cot. And there were about 20 of us in the dorm. And he'd been picking on me all the time. And my friend said, "Don't have anything to do with Louis. He'll beat you up. He's too big." And he unscrewed my leg, and my bed collapsed. And everybody in the dorm laughed. And I looked around and I found the leg. And I looked for Louis because I was going to hit him on the head with that leg from my bed. And the dorm leader, who happened to be a college student, said, "Okay, you guys, that's enough. Go outside and get it over with." So we both went outside in between two dorms, and Big Louie said something to me. He said to me, quote unquote, "Okay, you little Jew son of a bitch, I'm going to get you now." And I lunged for him, and I got his head in a hammerlock, and I kept punching away. And the next thing I remember, both knees on his shoulders, his back on the ground, and I'm punching him in the face, and I'm just screaming, "Now will you leave me alone? Now will you leave me alone?" And they pulled me off. And everybody in that camp was out there, fight, 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 and they saw what it was. Nobody ever picked on me again on the Lower East Side. And Big Louie, when he saw me coming, walked across the street to the other side of the street. That's the only time.
Do you think there's more meaning to that?
Oh, you betcha.
Tell me about it.
Oh, you betcha. Because somewhere in back of your mind, you're always thinking about relatives, friends, people that didn't survive. Because if you survived, you get on with it. You have a choice. You have a choice. You can, woe is me for the rest of your life, as some people do. Self-pity, it's a luxury I could never really afford. So I went on with it, and I got on with it, and I got on with my life.
What have you told your children, growing up, when your children were growing up, did you talk to them about being a survivor?
Well, yes. Yes. That's a special issue because their mother is also a survivor. Although she's never mentioned it, the why and the wherefores. I have. And they're aware of it. They are aware of it. There's no question about it. They've come to some of my lectures and they're aware of it. And they'll say, "Oh, poor Dad," because they've had a good life growing up here in St. Louis. But they're aware of it. But unless you've been there, unless you know, you can't really. You can't relate that unless it's been very personal.
What about for your, I know you have some young grandchildren.
Mm-hmm,
now.
mm-hmm.
Do you speak to them?
Not yet, no. I leave that to my children, what they want to tell them.
I want you to tell me exactly what happened at Kristallnacht. And you told me you did see it. And
Yeah.
What was happening?
Yeah. I was standing in the hallway, and our neighbor, Mrs. Pollock, came in and she was crying. And I said to her, "Mrs. Pollock, what's the matter?" And she said, "They're burning the synagogue." Now, by then, I was already pretty street smart. And I ran around the corner to see the synagogue burning. As I mentioned to you earlier, it was a congregation, the old Polish synagogue, sat 2,000 people, had 2 balconies for women. It was a big, big, big synagogue. I have pictures of the synagogue. I have the son of my cousin lives in Vienna, and he put together a book of all the synagogues in Vienna and Austria before 1938. And I have pictures of every single house of worship that was there, with the history of some of them. And I went around the corner, and there it was burning. And they were throwing the prayer books and the Torahs into the bonfire, like they're having a party. And I remembered that. I didn't remember that. You don't realize the significance of this when you're a kid. But when I went back for the first time in 1970, this is the year after my father died. He died in 1969. And I went to the Central Synagogue in Vienna and I said Kaddish for him. I went around the corner, and the rubble of Kristallnacht had still not been cleaned up. This is 32 years later. Disgraceful. Disgusting.
So after that point is when I imagine everything really started to change.
It all fell apart. Everything completely fell apart. It was just a question of getting out.
And in your home, was there talk? Were you trying to figure out how you were going to get out?
Absolutely. Absolutely. See, I always thought my father was the strong one. My mother was. My mother saved me, she saved herself, and she saved her husband. She couldn't save her brothers.
So tell me what happened after Kristallnacht.
After Kristallnacht, I think within a day or two, so you can understand this was all premeditated. They had planned on this. There was a knock on the door. The two Gestapo men were there, and they asked for my father and my two uncles, one of which was home, Uncle Leo, my mother's brother, and my dad. They identified themselves as Gestapo and said, "You'll have to come with us." My father had been shaving. He had shaving cream on his face. And he had a pajama top on, a pair of street pants, shoes, and he wiped the cream off his face. And this is all in front of our apartment, at the apartment door. And he said to my mother, "Erna, I'll be right back." And my mother, you kind of hear things, and she was the wise one. She said, "Paul, take a coat with you. It's November, it's cold. Vienna gets cold in November." So reluctantly, he put on an overcoat, and she stuck a cap in his pocket. And he and my Uncle Leo were taken away. And that particular day, of course, they arrested 30,000 men. 90% of them were either in Buchenwald or Dachau. 10% never got there. My father told me of what happened on the way there, how the beatings, the heart attacks, 10% of them didn't make it, froze to death. In a question, took him 4 or 5 days to get there. In 4 or 5 days, only 90% of them, he survived. He'd been an athlete in his youth. And being bald, he would hang out with the old guys. They didn't realize he was in his early 40s. So they didn't mess with him. They didn't bother him that much. And he wound up in Dachau with the other, or Buchenwald, as the case may have been, with the other 27,000. But the 3,000, nobody ever said, they completely disappeared. They arrested 30,000 people. And you can imagine what was going through the minds of the mothers and the sisters and the family. Where's my husband? Where's my father? Where's my brother? Where are they? Of course, we found out later the Germans always kept good records, and within about 10 days we got a postcard, "I'm in Dachau and everything is fine. I'm here." So my mother at least knew that he was alive.
And how did your mother explain to you when she decided to put you on the Kindertransport?
She said that she is going to England because she already had her passport. She's going to come to England, and that I'm going to go to England first. And I have to be in England, and I'm going to be waiting for her in England, and that she'll meet me there when she gets there, which will be very soon. So I was led to believe my mother is going to be coming to England, to follow me to England and to get me.
Were you frightened?
No. It's an adventure. Everything was made to be an adventure. It was an adventure. Never been frightened.
But you knew your father had been taken away.
Right, but I knew my father was a strong man. I knew he was alive. I knew my mother was getting him out of Dachau. We would talk about, I would hear conversations.
What about the other children on the train? Did you speak with them?
I don't recall, but I tell you what I do recall, and it was interesting. My mother insisted that I go to England. And we got through Holland. And when the train stopped in Rotterdam, before we boarded the ship for England, there were families Dutch families that came and took children in, you know. And I remember this couple came over, and the guy who was in charge of the kids on the train said, look, there's a nice family, they want to take care of you. And I said, no, my mother said I got to go to England. It's as positive as that. Just,
So when you get off in England, who came to you? What happened there?
oh, it was a bunch of kids. We got off the boat. There were people waiting for us. They put us on buses. Bear in mind, it's a short crossing. I'd never been on a ship before. I was sick to my stomach. When we were waiting for the ship, because the weather was bad, it was already December, close to Christmas time. The weather was bad. All they gave us to eat as we were waiting to board the ship, and there was maybe 200-300 kids, they gave us applesauce and rice. I remember that. It was stewed apples and rice. And I got on that ship, and I was so tired. I tried to sleep, and I got sick to my stomach, and I vomited everything. So when I got to England, because the crossing was short, it was in the morning, I was in no shape. I was put on a bus, and taken to a camp which they had set up for the children. So we were amongst the first to be at this particular camp.
And what was the camp like?
The camp was originally set up as a summer camp, and where kids would go in the summertime. Well, here it is winter. No insulation, thin blankets, not much food, cold. All I can remember is the cold, constant cold. You had to take care of yourself. Your meals were served communally. You sat at the table with 10 other guys, and they would put out dishes, and everybody would help themselves. And somebody said, well, why don't you give the kid a chance to eat? You see, the other guys, the 15 and 16-year-olds, there wasn't that much food to eat anyway. They ate most of it, and I didn't have much to eat. I never was assertive that way. I was always taken care of. So I started hanging around the kitchen. And there's always plenty to eat in the kitchen. That's where I would spend my time, around the kitchen. So I was never hungry. Didn't bother eating with them at the table. I would sit with them, but I knew I had enough to eat in the kitchen. There was always something to eat in the kitchen.
And how long did you stay in this camp?
Well, let's see. Spent a year and a half in England. In this particular camp, I would say till the spring of about April of 1939. And then from the camp, I was, I'd say probably March of 1939. And I was sent to a family, a husband and wife in London. Lovely people, the Norrises, childless, and wanted a child. I came in. Then when my mother came to England, they realized that I was not theirs to keep. So I was sent back into a camp, and because my mother had come to see me. She thanked them and everything. Because I was a little resentful. I was having a good time. I had my own room, private school. It was pretty good. And here's my mother again. She's going to interfere. She's going to tell me what to do. But I went to another camp. I was there for a short period of time. And then from that camp, I was sent, I was there for probably 3 or 4 weeks. And then I was sent into a group home near the, on the shore on the coast in a city called Ramsgate, which is on the channel. And there I was in a non-Jewish group home with 8 or 10 other children. I believe they were Episcopalians, lovely people, but they took these kids in. Now we stayed there until the summer of 1939, when the war became imminent, and the children were all being evacuated out of the coastal areas into the center of England. And I was sent to the center of England to a little place called Clifton upon Dunsmore in Warwickshire County, which is just outside of the city of Rugby, where Rugby College is, just a suburb. And I was boarded with a family called the Roaches. He worked for the railroad. I remember, again, nice man, had a club foot with 2 daughters and a niece that had also been evacuated from London area, and so all of us, we lived at their house. But there were other children that lived in that little village that were evacuated out of the coastal areas and out of London. They knew that the war was imminent. And I was there I even have a report card, 5th grade report card, 5th form, from Warwickshire County, which I've saved. And I would see my mother periodically. I traveled by myself. I'm 11 years old. Traveled by myself. Get on a bus, get on a train, knew where to go. My mother would meet me, and went to where she was a cook, stayed with her. I remember my mother crying for her brothers, crying for her family. My father was also in England. He was in a camp in England for men. They're teaching him how to be a gardener. Eventually, within about a month, he left the camp and he lived with my mother as the gardener on the estate. He did now become a gardener. No pay, but that's okay. They were together. And my mother saved every penny that she had. And then my uncle got us a sponsor to come to the United States. So the war had already started in September, and this is April of 1939. I'm sorry, 1940. The war had been raging for 6 months. And we left, the 3 of us met in London. We spent about 3 weeks in London, off Kilburn Road, Northwest 6. I remember it quite well because I had open eyes, I had an open mind. And from there we went to Southampton, and we boarded the ship, which is a whole chapter of its own. The trip coming across is a whole chapter of its own. But we made it. We all the 3 of us got here.
And how did that make you feel?
Oh, well, whilst I was with the Roaches, I had a very dear friend. His name was Joseph. And we would discover things like American comic books. And we would read things in the comic books. Of course, the thing I could never figure out is, what's a hot dog? You know, it's a Heisterhund, what's a hot dog? But we had access to these marvelous little things, and we would see life in the United States. And it was another adventure. And I was going to be a movie star, and I was going to do this, and I was going to, you know how kids are at the age of 11, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and blah, blah, blah. It was an adventure, the beginning of another adventure. So I could put England behind me, and I'm going to come here, and this is going to be a whole different adventure. And it has been, it still is.
Absolutely. So when you talk about being a survivor, what does that mean to you?
Being a survivor means that you have to relate to others how important it is, particularly as Jews, that we survive. I have been able to give that to my children. They are survivors. They've had their adversity in life. They've all come up on top. They've paid their dues. We all pay our dues, so to speak. You hear that expression so often. But you have to learn not to have, as I mentioned earlier, self-pity. You can't feel, you've got to get on with things. Life is too short. My father had cancer. He was 75 when he died. And I remember he was at home. I flew up to New York to be with him. And he knew he was going to die. And he said to me, "Das Leben ist ein Traum. Life is a dream." I remembered my father saying that. Life is a dream. Life is short. So it's what you do with it. It's how you relate to other people and how you can relate about your experiences. And when you reach a certain age, you're pretty positive about your views. You're not going to change them.
That is so wonderful. So in actuality, that's what you did here today.
Absolutely. All the time. I've had innumerable careers. I've never been hungry. I've always been able to make a living. I'm a survivor. And you learn how to survive in this world.
And the wonderful thing is that you can come to the St. Louis Holocaust Memorial Learning Center and teach the children.
Exactly.
So tell me that.
That's it. That's it. That was the thought that I had in back of my mind when I was told that there are children that would come here, that would go through the museum. How shocking it is for the children to go through the museum. So when I do talk to the children, I don't talk at them. I don't talk from a point of self-pity, but something that in this short lifetime that I have experienced, and that unfortunately there may be some adversities in life that they will have to face, that they should be strong and that they must be strong in order to overcome this.
I love that. Real quickly, I want to go back because I think this is an important aspect, is what a privileged life you had. Tell me before, Germany marched into Austria, what your life was like.
Oh, well, the life for the upper middle class Jews, there are several people here in St. Louis that can tell you even more so. They're older than I. Ziggy Halpern, I don't know if you know Ziggy or not. Ziggy and I, Ziggy being a few years older, I'm only 78. He's 85 now, so he knows a little bit more. Life was good. Maid, chauffeur, summer vacations, always out somewhere, never in the city. Private after school camps. They even tried to teach me how to English. We had an English person that came over and tried to teach me how to speak English because we knew in the 30s that something is going to be happening. Life was good. Life was good. Should never have had it any worse. That's my mother always used to say that. Life was good.
Did your parents find, how did they, from having such a good life to what happened to coming here with nothing, how did they deal with that?
They never discussed it. My mother worked, as I said, my mother came and she did what most refugee women do of any nationality. She worked as a domestic and as a cook. She cooked and cleaned for people. My father, who didn't speak much English, peddled neckties and underwear. They're survivors. When the war broke out, we came here in 40, the war broke out in 41, my mother got a job in a factory. And my father started traveling. Again, during the entire war, he sold neckties and underwear. Then he traveled all over with that. After the war, he went to work for an old friend of his, whom he had worked for in Vienna. And he kept the plant of 100 people busy. He was the only salesman for this particular outfit. And it's called Art Favors. And he traveled all over the country for them until he retired at the age of 65. Took his Social Security, got a small pension from Vienna. I sent money home every month so their rent would be covered. I mean, talked to my parents every week. There was never a week that went by I didn't talk to them because we shared so much. We were so close. They're just the three of us. So they had a good life. They just transferred everything from there here. My mother spent winters in Florida. In the summers, there was no air conditioning in New York. Summers were spent in the mountains. And all the Austrians and Germans and then the Hungarians in 1950, after the revolution in 56, went to this little town in upstate New York, about 2 hours from New York, called Fleischmann's. And they took it over. Then they had their own hotels, their own coffee houses, their own restaurants up there. They kept life, and that's where they spent their summers. My father would come up there, and that's where he would spend the summers. Many of the husbands would come up there on weekends and work during the week, whatever they had to do, but their wives were there. It was a good life. And then as soon as the weather got cold, my father went on the road. I was in school. My mother went to Florida, went to South Beach. In those days, it was reasonable. And you're going back into the 40s and 50s, and that's where she spent her winters. So it wasn't a bad life.
Just briefly, when you went back to Vienna in 1970, yeah, we're almost done.
Yeah, okay. No.
When you went back to Vienna in 1970, other than seeing the rumble, what did that feel like for you?
Well, it felt like nothing had really changed. You see, Vienna, even though it was badly damaged during the Second World War, a lot of bombings, and then it was partitioned into a French sector, an English sector, an American sector, and a Russian sector. So they had 4 people there. But the interesting thing about Vienna is that the opera house, the apartment buildings, everything was rebuilt exactly like it was before World War II. So when you went to Vienna, it was like it had been, like the war had never existed.
How did that make you feel?
Well, surprised, because, it's like the statement, some of my best friends are Jewish, my best friends have been Jews. Where have all the Nazis gone? What happened to all the Nazis? Because 95% of all the people in Vienna and Austria were Nazis. Camp guards, actually beating people, killing people. What happened to them? That's my thought. That's my thought. But otherwise, it was interesting. I traced back my steps.
Let's see.
But if you go to Vienna today, there's no mention of the Second World War, you see. They've rebuilt it just like it was before. This charming old city is still there. They still have their coffee houses. They still eat their pastries in the afternoon and drink their coffee. It hasn't changed a bit.
So in other words, you're thinking that, they've just gone on, but they're the same. They're still...
Oh, absolutely, because I know this firsthand. My first cousin, the son, is there. As I said, he's a retired physician. Anti-Semitism is still very, very strong. Very strong. The hatred of the Jews is still there. It's the whys and wherefores, that's part of history.
Do you think that the fact that finally it took 50, 60 years for survivors to start speaking out, will that make a difference?
It makes a difference to the people that we're able to have contact with. Unfortunately, there are too few of us, and particularly Holocaust survivors. And there are really too few to speak out. There are too few of us. And I don't know. We are the moral conscience of the world, so to speak, because we tell it like it is. It's much easier to live without facing the truths. The truths are undeniable. But unfortunately, there aren't enough of us. And I don't mean Jews, but I mean what we call the self-righteous people. What about all the Muslims? They don't talk out. They don't talk out to millions and millions of Muslims. They're not necessarily condoning it, but it was no different in Europe at that time. A few of them spoke out. They wound up in Dachau or Buchenwald. The Catholics didn't. Well, the Protestant ministers did. The Muslims are not saying that we've got a group amongst us that's wrong. There's no difference. It's not right. It's wrong. They're not saying it. Those are the ones that have to speak up. It's not for us. As I said, we're the moral conscience of the world. We can prod it a little bit. But I've been inside, and then the gal said I'm attacking the Quran one time. And I made the statement to her that the guys who flew into the Trade Center were not Presbyterians. Every act perpetrated, every single act perpetrated, and I don't care if it's in Lebanon, when they bombed the barracks, the hotels, the embassies, the ships, the killings, everything is from Muslims between the age of 17 and 40. No other group. And they won't say that they've done something wrong, the rest of them.
So you feel that there's a correlation between Hitler, the Nazis, and what happened with the people of Austria against the Jews is the same as what's happening?
It could be. It could be. They're a very strong minority. And they're going to have to speak up. And they have to stand up and be counted. You can't hide.
So is that what your message is, to speak up?
Yeah. If you hear intolerance, you have to speak up for it. If you're around evil, you have to speak up against evil. There's no question of getting away from it. You have to. There's right and there's wrong. I've lived too long to not face the realities of it. Can't turn my back on it. How's that sound?
Sounds good. So when you walk out of here today after speaking to these kids, how does that feel?
Feels pretty good. I've talked to a lot of groups. I feel that I've accomplished something, and that when I leave here, I still have time to go across the street and take care of myself and get a workout in at the health club, which I will do. And then I'll watch the ball game tonight.
Perfect. That's perfect. Thank you.